In 1694, a Scottish man named John Law killed someone in a duel in London. He was also a compulsive gambler. But years later, this same guy helped create the system that runs modern global finance. So after fleeing England, Law spent his nights at gambling tables across all of Europe. He studied the math behind the games carefully. He learned how probability, risk, and reward actually worked. And over time, he came to see money as just a way of keeping score. So by the early 1700s, France was in serious trouble. King Louis XIV had spent decades fighting wars and building grand palaces. The country was completely buried in debt, and ordinary people were crushed by taxes. The root problem was actually pretty simple. All money had to be backed by physical gold or silver. There wasn't enough metal in circulation for people to trade, pay taxes, or grow their businesses. The government was spending far more than it had, and no way to fix it. France was stuck, and that made it the perfect place for a bold outsider to try something pretty risky. France was so desperate that the regent handed a convicted killer control of the national bank. The question wasn't whether paper money was a good idea. The question was whether a man like this, a gambler, an exile, a murderer, could actually pull it off before a nation already on its knees finally collapsed. Law walked into the French regent's office with a radical idea. Money, he said, didn't need to be made of heavy metal. It could be printed on paper and hold value simply because the government said it did. The regent agreed. Back then, this was pretty wild though. In 1716, Law launched the Banque Generale. For the first time on a large scale, a European government institution began handing out paper banknotes directly to the public. It worked right away. Trade actually picked up. The national debt started to shrink, which would have been a triumph, except Law had just made a decision that made the whole thing mathematically impossible to survive. Paper money is really just a promise. Law knew he needed something real and valuable behind that promise, before people started asking for their gold back. He found his answer on a map. The vast French territory of Louisiana stretched across North America. Law chose this land to back his paper economy. He marketed it as a paradise of overflowing with gold and riches. In reality, it was a harsh, undeveloped wilderness. But the public didn't know that yet. In 1717, Law created the Mississippi Company. He invited French citizens to buy shares in it. Their money would supposedly fund the mining of precious metals from the colony. Law didn't even stop there. He absorbed rival trading companies, took over the national mint, and gained control of French tax collection. He rolled all of it into Europe's first giant corporation. Through a mix of monopoly power and aggressive marketing, he convinced an entire nation that a distant swamp was the most valuable investment on Earth. And it was working. The share price was climbing. The whole country was getting rich. But back in Louisiana, the settlers Law had shipped over there were dying of disease, eating crawfish to survive, and writing letters home that the company's agents were doing everything they could to intercept and not let get back to France. Law had merged his central bank directly with his own company. The bank printed paper money. Investors used that money to buy company shares. To keep the share price rising, the bank simply printed more money. As each new batch of shares hit the market, investors snapped them up with freshly printed cash. The stock price shot from 500 to 10,000 in less than a year. The wave of new wealth triggered something close to mass hysteria. The craze was so intense, it actually gave birth to the word millionaire. People from every walk of life scraped together whatever they had to buy into the Mississippi Company. But there was a price. All that unbacked paper money flooding the economy caused the cost of everyday goods to skyrocket. Inflation surged alongside the stock price, eventually hitting 23% in a single month. The explosion of new millionaires wasn't connected to any real growth or actual output from the colony. It was an artificial loop. Printed money chasing overvalued stock. And it was mathematically guaranteed to fall apart. The only thing holding the whole structure up was the colony. And the reports sailing back from Louisiana were getting harder to hide. So, reports finally reached France from Louisiana. The colony was a small, struggling settlement surrounded by swamps. There was no gold, none at all. When investors realized the asset backing their wealth was worthless, trust collapsed instantly. Panic swept through Paris. Thousands of shareholders raced to the bank, desperate to swap their paper notes for physical gold. Law scrambled to stop the collapse. He limited how much gold people could hold. He cut his company's share price in half, trying to force people to accept the paper. Nothing worked. The market crashed completely. The paper millionaires were wiped out. Working class families lost everything. Law fled Paris as angry mobs formed in the streets. The financial damage was enormous, but the deeper wound was psychological. The French people's trust in their government's financial system completely destroyed. The trauma lasted for generations. France refused to use paper currency again for 80 years. John Law spent his final years drifting across Europe. He ended up back at the gambling tables in Venice, dying poor and largely forgotten by the financial world that he helped build. And yet, history has one last strange twist. His execution of the system was a disaster, fueled by corruption and reckless money printing. But his core ideas were actually right. Unbacked paper currency, central state banking, and publicly traded corporate shares. These were all tools Law introduced in Paris. Today, those same exact mechanisms are the foundation of the entire global economy. John Law accidentally drew the blueprint for modern capitalism. And through spectacular failure, he proved one thing above all else. The system he destroyed and the system we live in today are the same system. Which means every time you swipe a card, take out a loan, or buy a stock, you're trusting a gambler's idea. The only question is whether we've learned to trust it better than he did. If you like this and want to read more, check out the links below. Some great resources to dive deeper into this whole thing, and stay tuned for the next video.